Erev Tov, good evening to everyone. I hope all is well. I hope people are getting a few moments of reprieve from Pesach prep to come and learn together. It's a very great privilege, as always, to spend some time learning. And this particular topic is just of great interest to me. Um, and I've done a fair amount of research on some of these issues that we're going to be sharing and learning about tonight. It's important to know that I am coming from a rabbinic space and not a place of great expertise. Um, that I want to, recognize and give appropriate humility and deference to those who are professionals in the mental health space. This is something that we've looked into and talked about and spent a lot of time thinking about, but I'm not professing to be a mental health professional or even play one on TV. We are just going to learn together some what I think are absolutely fascinating viewpoints in Chazal and see some very, very interesting psychological insights. I want to make two quick points before we kind of dive in, and we'll hopefully have a sort of a very clear roadmap and orderly point. The first is that it's always an interesting question when you look at Chazal and you see contemporary scientific or psychological or other kinds of research, and like, is it that you're, painting the target around the arrow, so to speak? The way I see it is as follows, which is that I think that Chazal have had such incredible wisdom, and often, sometimes the narration or the narrative or the way of formulating that is happens in different ways in terms of scientific research or psychological research, and so it ends up to me being a fascinating, not that validation, so to speak, but a prism through which to see so much of our ancient and timeless ritual through what is now being seen in more clear and stark ways in the world of psychology and other types of things. I think that's just always so very interesting. So that's something, that's the prism through which I look at it. I look at it with deference to the ancient statements of Chazal and Jewish tradition, with this mind that our worldview can be expanded once we learn and hear about really interesting psychological and scientific research. And I think that's the prism through which we'll learn what we're going to talk about tonight. And the other point is that it's not just about the Seder. I think the Seder is a really great model for what exactly that we do, but really the whole Pesach experience. It's worthwhile to understand personality and our mindset is shaped. And this is the buzzwords that we talk about. We hear a lot about. We hear this famous phrase, the anxious generation. We hear about depression, anxiety, what they call a DSM-4, which is a list of variety of issues and disorders. I'm not right. What we're going to try and do is look at really three, and we're going to actually start a little bit from the psychology. Three well-known, or maybe not so well-known, researched psychological concepts that, it's not to say that these are the only ones, and there's so many more, and this is not so much current events in terms of what the lingua franca, what people are talking about now, but there's these three ideas. We'll actually try and pull out maybe one or two more that are sort of underlying them, but three basic ideas that are ways in which contemporary, or not even so contemporary, psychologists have done research about how the mind works. And then we'll see within Chazal and within the Jewish tradition how some of those tools have been utilized and mirrored in incredible ways for really timeless times of Jewish history. So we're going to talk about these three concepts. One is called cognitive dissonance, a term you may have heard of. The second is called narrative identity theory. And the third is called hedonic or hedonistic adaptation. Don't worry, we'll repeat what these all are. But these are three concepts that a lot of research has been done on these topics. And we're going to try and see how we actually see a really interesting thread throughout Jewish tradition within the Pesach experience. So let's get started. Let's see if I can get all this here. Okay, we'll get started here, where I want to sort of use the following framing. of what we're going to talk about, which is the Seder and Pesach is meant, frankly, all the Yom Tovim have this term of lizkor. Laman tizkor yom tzecha me'eretz Mitzrayim. There's a din, a halacha called remembering the Exodus from Egypt. Zechirat Yetziat Mitzrayim. But it's not simply recalling or recounting facts or events. It's meant to be, yes, of course, Seder commemorating the past, but actually it is, again, through some of this research, you see what I would call spiritual technology, rewiring the mind. What I mean is you use these capabilities that you see within the world of the contemporary research, and you see how Chazal were so brilliant in pulling the levers of the human mind to enhance the nature of the experience. They designed what the Seder is meant to be as, I would call it a structured curriculum for how we not only to fulfill the mitzvah of Pesach, but how we flourish and how we think through the way in which we define Jewish life and Jewish destiny. So let's talk about that lens, and I think that the Seder and Pesach overall has that. And the first, we're actually going to look a little bit from Hasidic thought. But let's, look at the concept, which is called cognitive dissonance. This was, I think, made famous by a psychologist by the name of Festinger in 1959, Leon Festinger. And he basically said the following. Cognitive dissonance is essentially the psychological discomfort that you feel when you have two conflicting, what they call cognitions, right? Beliefs, values, behaviors. And when they conflict and you hold two but seemingly contradictory things at the same time. And you have this horrible anxiety, you have this tension inside you that is often can be physically, genuinely painful, and you seek some sort of relief, right? So the classic example is Aesop's fable, right? Aesop's fable, the fox and the grapes, right? The fox and the grapes, where you had a fox who was really, really hungry for some grapes, and the grapes were too high for him to reach. So he now had two cognitions that he conflicted. One is that he really wants these grapes, and number two is that he doesn't want to do the work to get it. So what does he do? He says, no, the grapes were sour anyway. Concept of sour grapes, right? That's where it comes from. That the idea is that you simply change your beliefs to, lessen that pain. So there's this experiment that 1959 Festinger did. He had a colleague named Carl Smith, and he made it as follows. He had a group of people that were asked to perform a boring, tedious task. They were like turning pegs and moving spools for 1 hour, okay? And they were told, all right, so they did this really boring task, horribly, really annoying task for 1 hour. And then they were told, hey, there's a bunch of people coming to do this after you. Tell them that the task was interesting and enjoyable. Tell them that this was a really fun, amazing thing to do. Half of the people were paid $20. In 1959, that was a really lot of money. Half of the people were paid $20, and the other half were paid $1. And what he tried to measure, this psychologist, was how passionate were they when they described this task. It was a boring, as my term, boring as stink. It was a boring, horrible task. But they were trying to convince other people that it was good. So he said something fascinating. By a huge margin, the people who were paid $1 reported that the task was amazing, was incredible, was so interesting. The people who were paid $20, they were a lot more lukewarm. Yeah, I guess it was okay. I guess. Like, you told me to say it was interesting, so I'll say it was interesting. But the people who were paid $1 were passionate. We're like, oh my gosh, this was amazing. This was incredible. This was wonderful. Here's Festinger's explanation. He says, if you lie for a large sum, then you can tell yourself, yeah, I did this for the money. I did it for the money. But if you basically tell this lie about how it was an interesting activity for just $1, for almost nothing, your mind has to now deal with this contradiction. 1 second. I can't say, like, I didn't do it for the money. The money was nothing. So on one hand, I have like this sense of, well, my cognition of that it was a boring activity. On the other hand, I just wasted my time and I'm going to feel like an idiot for wasting my time. I only got $1. So the people therefore changed their mindset and actually changed what they believed. It was sour grapes. They believed that in order to reduce this inner contradiction, that this was actually a fun thing to do. And therefore, even though it made sense that they didn't get $1, they were going to tell everybody it was great. The idea is when your actions and your values collide, instead of admitting, oh, I was wrong, the way Festinger says, you then rewrite your values. You rewrite your values, right? That's the fox and the grapes, right? You can't change what we did. We just change what it meant, right? So people rationalize, yeah, when you cut corners in business, you, instead of saying, I was wrong, I cut corners in business, you say, everyone does it. I'm still a good guy, right? You change, or it wasn't really cutting corners, right? We're invested in seeing ourselves as good, and we therefore become kind of this internal defense attorney. The idea of that sense of rationalization is part of this cognitive dissonance. And sometimes these rationalizations drift further and further from the truth. So this idea of cognitive dissonance is incredibly powerful. It's the way the Kotzker Rebbe explains the Akedat Yitzchak of basically what was such a powerful thing that Abraham did not kill his son, because the Torah says at the time where Abraham did not kill his son, he says, Atayadati, now I know that you're truly fearing of God. He says, because he had invested so much in basically saying, oh, this isn't really murder. It's not a problem. It's okay. And then to be told, no, you should stop. That was a total rewriting, and it went against. He had to overcome this very powerful cognitive dissonance. That's the Kotzker Rebbe's explaining. So interestingly, the Hasidic thinkers actually say that this is the meaning behind B'dikat Chametz. Behind B'dikat Chametz, right? Where they basically say that Chametz represents sort of inflated illusion. Chametz is the Yetzer Hara. That's what Chazal define it as. It's like your puffed up ego. The idea that you ferment something and it distorts the simple, honest dough into something swollen. Again, this is all symbolic. The Gemara Brachos says there's something called Se'or Sheba'isa, the yeast in the dough. The metaphor that the rabbis use for the evil inclination is exactly this. Something that expands the heart away from your natural state, right? What is B'dikat Chametz in its essence? It's the search for truth, right? So the Mishnah says we search for this chametz by candlelight. Why do we search by candlelight? Because, says the Sfas Emes, a focused, intimate illumination that, says the Gemara and the Mishnah, it forces you into the cracks, into the the corners that are hidden. It sharpens. It stops that sense of, oh, it's all okay. No, I go to every crevice and every corner and I find that hidden crumb of chametz. Again, we'll leave the from a mindset standpoint, and I say, I'm not going to just rationalize. I'm going to actually look. Says the Ramban. Ramban says the practice that you remove the chametz from the holes, the corners, etc. Says the Ramban, it's a metaphor for the human psyche. The most dangerous chametz is the inner se'or sheba'isa, that inner crumb, that small tolerated dishonesty, the ego inflation, right? That you inflate so much, it kind of feels like truth. The Sfas Emes, and this is the great Hasidic thinker, says it's the inflation of the self. And so what we do is, says the Sefer HaChinuch, your values often influence your actions, but sometimes your actions influence your values. Usually you would think, I believe in chesed, so I'm going to do chesed. Says the Sefer Achich, no. Sometimes you do chesed, and you actually use cognitive dissonance in a good way. You spend a lot of time doing kind things and good things and helping people. And then you watch as somehow helping people and doing kind things becomes more important to you. So we actively spend so much time on Pesach doing stuff, right? From the cleaning to the bedika, to the burning, to the Seder, which is full of ritual. Ritual is exactly this. You mold your character, right? The famous phrase the Sefer Chinuch was known for is Acharei Hamaasim Nimshachim Halevavot. Following your actions, your heart follows. All right, following your actions goes your heart. Acharei Hamaasim, after your action, Nimshachim Halevavot, your heart follows. So it's this term that Festinger and there's a famous psychologist, Eric Erickson, used, but it is truly within the framework of everything that we do when it comes to Pesach. And that's a sort of a concept of Bedikat Chametz is confronting that dissonance. The Sefer HaChinuch idea of much of our ritual, all of Pesach, is confronting and molding ourselves in a positive way. And that's a key, a key piece of the Pesach experience that we actually can now see in a really unique way through the prism of Chazal and the prism of psychology, which I think is really interesting. Okay, I want to move. So that's the cognitive system. I want to move to the next concept, what's called the narrative identity theory. It was made famous in the late 20th century by a thinker by the name of Dan McAdams. Dan McAdams created what he called the life story model of identity. And his theory is as follows. He says the most powerful way you can develop your identity is through stories, through a narrative, through a narration. And beyond like just your natural personality traits, your identity, you don't think of yourself as a angry person or a neat person. You think of yourself through the stories you tell yourself of your life. And you reconstruct, you think through your past, your present, your anticipated future, and you make a story. And he says that's the way humanity develops its sense of self. So according to McAdams, these life stories have settings, they have characters, they have ups and downs, but his research was really interesting. He said that if you change someone's narrative, you can actually change their mental health. Fascinating. He said there was a study of psychotherapy clients, and they found that they would tell people and develop through their work a person telling their stories, right? They would tell their stories. And there's a famous case where two siblings grew up in the same house, and they had, we would argue, the same childhood. One told a story of I was neglected. I was always on my own. I was without any support. And a sibling in that same household said, I was independent. I had freedom to. Now, they're the same acts. When you tell them as a different story, it creates a different sense of self, right? The way he would say is, we as humans do not merely have experiences, we organize them. Our mind is, the human brain is very good at organizing things into categories, and he would say into narrative arcs, into stories. And so basically, what is how do you think about yourself? You think about what you imagine about your past, what you think is going to be in the future, and that's who you are, right? So there was therefore research of people who saw, again, human life as a story. And when there were people who would go through trauma, they would say, I went through a really difficult experience that gave me the strength to then, confront all sorts of challenges. Others said, I went through this difficult experience and I was frozen in that moment of pain. Right? Now, of course, we know that, if you see suffering as an end, your life is going to evolve in one way. If you see difficulty, yisurin, so to speak, as something that therefore was a catalyst for growth, well, then the research shows that there is documented higher levels and of well-being, and essentially we become the stories that we tell. That's the theory that McAdams suggests. And again, they call it the narrative identity theory, the story of the self. Now, we, from the Pesach experience, know this incredibly well, right? The Mishnah says, right? In every generation, a person is obligated to see himself as if he went out from Egypt. Because of this, in other words, we don't simply recall facts. The whole Maggid is what I'd call narrative identity. There is a din, a halacha, that every single day we are supposed to remember the Exodus from Egypt. That we do in Shema. Shema has, hearkening to the Exodus from Egypt. On Pesach, there is a mitzvah of Sipur, Yetziat Mitzrayim, telling a story, and it has all these rules that are built on making it a narrative, making it a story. V'igara talabincha, convey information in a question-answer format and make it a story. So think about actually the key point of the Seder is matchilin bignut, which means we start with the difficulty. Avadim hayinu, we were slaves. We're not conveying information. But what are we doing? We are setting up a narrative of we had a difficult time that we grew from. Hashem took us out from there. And by the way, we do this in the first person. Hashem took us. Bechol dor in every generation, we need to see. And says the Maharal writes this in great length and in beautiful detail. The Maharal, and frankly the Netziv also did that the same, that's what he said, that you create the story of the parallel of just like the Jewish people had difficult times and they grew out of it and they became this wonderful Hallel, of thank you Hashem for redeeming us and getting us to the promised land, so to speak. We have that sense of it's all about the narrative, all about the story, because that's how we define ourselves. And what's fascinating is that the Rambam actually takes both of the previous and the previous idea, the cognitive dissonance idea, and this as well. Because the Rambam actually changes the words of the Mishnah and the way he writes it. He says that not only are you supposed to see yourself, you're supposed to show yourself. You need to do rituals, do things, build that sense of what your values are, and within the context of telling the story. So says the Maharal in his Kruot Hashem, Yetziat Mitzrayim wasn't a one-time historical event. It is a foundational act that continuously defines our story, our relationship with God, right? Bechol dor isn't like a trick, to make the story feel real. It's if my identity is rooted in the covenant, in this idea of Har Sinai and Yetziat Mitzrayim, it's a story in which every single person at every single Seder weaves your personal chapter in that story. Your professional struggles, your family journey, your spiritual ups and downs, all of them are, I call, subplots in the narrative of coming towards Avodat Hashem. And by the way, we don't just sit down and eat the matzah. We do a question and answer. We do the drashot. We tell the Maggid because we realize that the way the human psyche develops their identity is through story. Matzah is like the redemption, but you gotta feel redeemed because you tell your story of being redeemed. And so that's, I think, a key piece of a very interesting psychological concept that we see very clearly in the threads of what Chazal have been doing and telling us for ages. And I think that's a second really interesting topic. So again, we had this idea of the cognitive dissonance, and then this concept of narrative identity theory. There's a third concept that I wanted to talk about, which I found I had never heard of until doing, again, I spent a lot of time working on this year, thinking about this, something called hedonic or hedonistic adaptation. And there's a couple of researchers, a famous one is Brickman and Campbell. And in 1971, they wrote a paper that they basically argued something that you could say is a little bit cynical, or maybe it resonates. You'll tell me what you think. Brickman and Campbell argued that people tend to return to a relatively stable baseline of happiness, irrelevant of major things that happened. Basically, what they're basically, yesterday's miracle is today's normal. So in 1978, they studied two groups of people. One was a group of people who had won the lottery, and the other victims who had become paraplegic. Right? And they also had a control group. They did the study in a very robust way. And they watched these people over time. They found something fascinating. Over time, they found that the lottery winners were not dramatically happier than the control group, even though now they were fabulously wealthy. You've probably heard about all these things that, sometimes there's lots of stories about lottery winners who end up having a terrible fall from, and a horrible life. So their lottery winners, he found in this 1978 study, were not particularly happier than the control group. And he looked at the accident victims. He says they were generally less happy, but they weren't as devastated in their life satisfaction as might expect. Basically, both groups, the lottery winners and the accident victims, adapted. And basically what he argued was, that's what he called the hedonic treadmill. You rapidly return to a baseline level of happiness after a positive or frankly a negative change. It's this metaphor that captures the feeling, right? So you have this great joy, satisfaction. You have this event. Oh my goodness, I won the lottery. And then, as you see the curve here, over time, you just get back to that probably similar, maybe even sometimes lower baseline of, what was thrilled you last year, fairly noticeable now. Human beings quickly get used to both good and bad circumstances. That's what he argued. Somebody gets a raise at work and now they're making more. That's great. But often the classic thing would be they see the people making more even than them at the higher level and they feel deprived. This is exactly the famous story of the guy who begs God for the parking spot. And he says, God, I'm lucky, I need a parking spot so desperately. And he finds a spot and he says, God, oh, it's okay. I found one, right? He adapts to it being normal. Now, from a Torah standpoint, this is a spiritual danger, right? Because you acclimate to blessing and you're good. And what once becomes a miracle becomes an entitlement. And by the way, I don't know if I'm out of line here, but many argue, and I think that's happening often to the Jewish people, right? We had these incredibly devastating events that we're like, oh, now we need to be unified. Now we need to, have no rifts in our society. And then we adapt. We get back to that treadmill. We get back to that norm. And then we get back, unfortunately, to our fighting. Do you know what the clearest parallel to this is Dayanim? And the Nitziv writes this very clearly in his Haggadah Imre Shefer. Right after Magid, we haven't had the meal yet. Haggadah inserts a 15-line poem. And it functions, I guess, as a gratitude exercise. It pushes against what I call the hedonic drift or the hedonistic, treadmill, the adaptation of going back to the norm, right? Where 15 verses, or rather they say mirror the 15 steps of the Beit Mikdash, where there was something called Shir HaMa'alot. There was this ascending ladder of praise. What's the genius of Dayanim? The genius of Dayanim is it slows down the narrative. I mean, we just talked about narrative identity theory, that the narrative is so important. It slows it down. instead of racing from we were slaves, oh, we got Israel in the Beit HaMikdash, we were slaves, and now everything's all wonderful. That is a dangerous thing, because Dayenu is essentially, I would say, a hedge, a ritual hedge against the hedonic treadmill. It trains the mind to see each stage not just as obvious, oh, of course, that's what I got, moving on. No, every detail, every one of the 15 different things is a discrete miracle. So Dayenu is incredibly important because it pulls us out of the, just, oh, it was bad, now it's good, let's go, let's eat, right? The Mishnah says that we need to think about all of these miracles and we lay them out. And thank God there's a nice tune, because otherwise it would be really long and boring. But it's because of, it makes so much sense that there's this research of, like, you could have a great thing happen to you, and over sometimes a short, long period of time, you don't keep out. So look what the idea of this, the bar graph would be, where you have the blessing event, and then Dayenu, so to speak, is like this protocol that keeps you up there and having greater joy and satisfaction and greater gratitude, right? That sense of incremental gratitude in Torah thought, right? It's like an instruction manual of contrast past suffering, true feel of strength. You highlight each step separately. It's the Agada will basically say, don't just say, thanks for everything, God. No. Articulate the details. And it's that very powerful template. And, the reality is that we are very very likely to, this hedonic adaptation is very powerful. We are very likely to come back to the new normal. And then you're on baseline mode. So Dayenu is like a spiritual exercise in slowing down the story. Remember, we talked about that narrative, talked about doing things that shape your values and your ideals. Name the gifts. If Hashem had only given me X, I was one. I'm so lucky to have Y. And it's interesting that the Jewish year has so many holidays because they force us to slow down and recognize that aspect of, like, family comes together or these kind of things, and allows us to appreciate things in that way, which is very, very powerful psychologically. So Dayenu is very well founded, so to speak, it's been there for ages, but it's, a sense of, the idea of where we have what research shows us this hedonic adaptation actually is already within the toolbox of the Haggadah, which I think is very, very interesting. So these are three concepts, right? There's the cognitive dissonance, narrative identity theory, and the hedonic adaptation. There's something that underlies them all, kind of underlies all these things. And there's this very interesting work by a psychologist by the name of George Lowenstein. And he worked on the concept of curiosity, right? So Lowenstein describes curiosity as basically the gap between what we know and what we want to know. And so he says one of the most powerful pushes, powerful forces in the human psyche is feeling deprived, deprivation. It's this psychological tension. I need to know. I need to know. I'm going to do whatever I need to get that missing information, right? The idea is not just that I'm ignorant. Usually ignorant people are just, I don't know. They're not particularly passionate. But the person who is, I know something, but not enough. That curiosity is triggered when there's enough information to recognize that more is missing. There's more behind the scenes. I see the headline, but I know there's more. Curiosity lives in the gap between what I know and what I don't think I know yet. So interestingly, by the way, when somebody is given too much information, they shut down. If they're understimulated, they fall asleep, right? They tune out. And so what the Seder and what these ideas are meant to do is to hit the zone where there's enough disruption to awaken curiosity, but not so much confusing that you just say, I'm out. Think about the Seder in that context when we're trying to build that narrative. We're trying to develop the antidote to cognitive dissonance. We're trying to train ourselves to have this sense of anti-hedonic adaptation. And what do we do in the Seder? We just do stranger and stranger things. The Gemara, the Mishnah Pesachim, tells us how the Seder is structured around do weird stuff. Right? Why? It's Kadesh Yishalu Atinokot. It's an educational engine to try and engineer the attention. So the Ran says in Pesachim that the halacha mandates you to do things that turn on that curiosity. Kana ben Shoel, it's elicited. You pull that out, right? The Seder doesn't assume that the kid has attention. It engineers the attention through physical disruption. And that does weird things and has an asked-amanashtana, and it has the child try to say, what is unique here? And so she now is open to have that trigger of curiosity to be able to do all the things that we talked about. And so there's this term they call cognitive load, where what you're trying to do is, engineer that curiosity gap to, you're not thrown into ignorance. You know what a normal meal is. And you say, well, instead there's a deviation here. I dipped this number of times. I feel the gap between what's familiar and something's novel. And I guess it caused like a spiritual or a cognitive itch. You'd see it Mitzrayim and then scratches. And the Torah doesn't begin the Seder with answers. It begins with questions that make answers necessary. You're like, oh, I want to know. I want to know. And that's the mechanism, so to speak, the Seder uses. And that's something very, very powerful. And again, it's a psychological concept that there's a fair amount of research about, but it's within the Seder. And if we kind of think about it, there's a fascinating matrix here where we have different vulnerabilities as people. Self-justification, right? Psychologists call that cognitive dissonance. We have this thing called Bdikat Chametz. And the Rambam and the Sfat Emet, they explain that we get past that self-justification through that sense of honest searching of Seor Shebe'isa, right? We have this vulnerability of lack of cohesion, of like it not all fitting together. What is our sense of self? The way the psychologists talk about that is the narrative identity, right? How you tell a story and bring all the different pieces of your life together. We have Maggid that does exactly that. And again, the Mishnah and the Maharal, we see it in Chazal that get to that point where we feel redeemed. This is our story, and that is not simply remembering what happened to Egypt, but how we define our own personal narrative. And by the way, Netziv says that's what the Torah means in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, where it says that a person should say, Bishvili nibra olam, that you build that sense that the world was created for me, meaning I have a story, that all the things in the world somehow end up, that things that I interact with, part of my story. And then you have a very common sense of that hedonic adaptation, that numbness to blessing. So the psychologists call that hedonic adaptation. We have this thing called Dayenu that the Netziv builds and says it defeats that entitlement. It trains us to have that upper level, to keep that sense of gratitude and happiness way up here and not just regress down to the baseline down here. And then that sense of, kind of being on autopilot that underlies all of these things. Manishtana, right? The psychologists call that the curiosity gap. Manishtana says, the Ran explains, actively engage, elicit that curiosity so you can do all of these things. And so I would say that, Pesach is the mind's exodus, right? That the Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus that our mind goes through all of these things. And I just feel like it's so fascinating that there's these terms that are developed through research in, the scientific and the psychological world that absolutely have, well before them, all of these elements being used so powerfully within the Haggadah. We don't rationalize anymore because we demand honest searching. We don't have like, oh, I'm a nothing with nothing, because we create a narrative that there's a multi-layered arc of all the different things that got us better and made us stronger and allow us to tell a story that defines us as a positive and empowered sense of self. We don't feel entitled because we keep that step-by-step gratitude. Pesach uses the mind. The mind is our most powerful tool and resource. And Pesach, models behaviors, cognitions, ideas that allow us to harness the power of the mind and reach that sense of our destiny. The concept of building the idea of every aspect of our halachic, our ritual, our tefillah, our hashkafic lives within the context of all of these things. We see that there's great wisdom in the world of psychology. And again, those who are experts, I absolutely defer to them. But so many of the things that kind of, you take a step back, that seem weird, they're not a bug, they're a feature. We try to do this disruption to elicit curiosity. We list all the details to be able to define our gratitude in a sustainable way, right? There's so much positive growth that can happen when you see these kind of things within the Haggadah. Left to itself, the mind resolves tensions by rationalizing. Pesach says, take a candle, look for those crumbs, identify the gaps between your story and your actions, right? The narrative identity says that who you are depends on the story you tell about your life. So Maggid says, let's model with you how we're going to tell that story. Hedonic adaptation says, people just adapt to your new normal. And, you just go to your baseline. You don't have the capacity for sustained gratitude. Says Dayenu, no. We have a slow, structured ladder of thanks that we pause, and we therefore sustain that sense of where we're supposed to be. Curiosity is sparked by these gaps in knowledge, and we leverage that by building in formalized questions and strange accents. So it's not dry data, but it's opening up the escape room, so to speak, that sense of mystery. And so I would say that the Pesach invitation isn't about just Zachor, remember, but it's meant to relearn how we can emerge from Pesach less rationalizing, clearer sense of self as a redeemed servant of Hashem, a deep inner habit of gratitude. The Seder does its job, Pesach does its job. And that's the avoda, so to speak, that awaits us each Yom Tov. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining. I'll unmute so people can ask any questions, but looking forward to be able to experience that all together with us, B'mheira B'meinu, here in our community, but also B'Mashiach Tzidkenu B'mheira.